Hello there, and welcome to the Summon, the African Summon, where we connect you to Africa and African culture. In this book reading series, we explore some of the work of Africa's greatest writers who used their work to immortalize African culture. We're taking you to in this two-part series to Nigeria, where the incomparable Chinua Achebe writes Chike and the River. He uses his characters to show us relationships between children and their parents and how close knit the bonds are between friends and relatives and even society as a whole, how they use the social bonds to execute justice. Invite your neighbors, your friends, and your family to the fireside and join us. Thank you. Chapter 1. Chike leaves his village. Chike lived with his mother and two sisters in the village of Omofia. His father had died many years ago. His mother worked very hard to feed, clothe the three children, and send them to school. She grew most of the food they ate: yams, cassava, maize, beans, plantains, and many green vegetables. She also traded in dry fish, palm oil, kerosene, and matches. Chike was now 11 years old, and he had never left his village. Then one day, his mother told him that he would be going to Onitsha in the new year to live with his uncle, who was a clerk in one of the firms there. At first, Chike was full of joy. He was tired of living in a bush village and wanted to see a big city. He had heard many wonderful stories about Onitsha. His uncle's servant, Michael, had told him that there was a water tap in the very compound where they lived. Chike said this was impossible, but Michael had sworn to the truth by wetting his finger on his tongue and pointing it to the sky. Chike was too thrilled for words, so he would no longer wake up early in the morning and go to the stream. The trouble with their village stream was that the way to it was very rough and stony, and sometimes children fell and broke their water pots. In Onitsha, Chike would be free from all these worries. Also, he would live in a house with an iron roof instead of his mother's poor hut of mud and thatch. It all sounded so wonderful. But when the time actually came for Chike to leave his mother and his sisters, he began to cry. His sisters cried too, and even his mother had signs of tears in her eyes. She placed one hand on his head and said, "Go well, my son. Listen to whatever your uncle says and obey him. Onitsha is a big city full of dangerous people and kidnappers. Therefore, do not wander about the city. In particular, do not go near the river Niger. Many people get drowned there every year." She gave Chike many other words of advice. He nodded his head and sniffed because his nose was running. Chike's nose always ran when he cried. "Stop crying," said his mother. "Remember, you are now a big boy, and big boys don't cry." Chike wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Then he took his small wooden box with his mother, which his mother had bought from James Okeke, the local carpenter. Inside it was his few clothes and school books. "Let's go," said his uncle, who had been waiting patiently. "If we don't hurry now, we'll miss the lorry." Chike set the box on his head and followed his uncle. They were going to the main road half a mile away to take the lorry past their village to Onitsha. It was a very old lorry called Slow and Steady. It always had great difficulty going up any hill. Whenever it got to a steep hill, the driver's mate would jump down and walk behind it with a big wooden wedge. Sometimes the passengers were asked to climb down and help push the lorry. The 40-mile journey to Onitsha took Slow and Steady more than 3 hours. Sometimes it broke down completely. Then the journey might take a whole day or more. Chike was, however, lucky on the day he made the journey. Slow and Steady was in good form and did not break down at all. It only stopped after every hill to take a tin of water. Chapter 2, Chike in Onitsha. At first, Onitsha looked very strange to Chike. He could not say who was a thief or a kidnapper and who was not. In Omoafia, every thief was known. But here, even people who lived under the same roof were strangers to one another. Chike was told by his uncle's servant that sometimes a man died in one room and his neighbors in the next room would be playing his gramophone. It was all very strange. But as the months passed, Chike began to feel at home in Onitsha. He made friends at school and became very popular among them. His best friend was called Samuel. They were about the same age. Samuel was very good at football. He could dribble past any opponent. Whenever he played particularly well, his admirers clapped and shouted, SMOG, SMOG. SMOG was Samuel's nickname which he gave himself. His full name was Samuel Maduka Obi. So his initials were SMO. Then one day he saw that if he added a G to his initials, he would become SMOG. He immediately did so. In Onitsha, the letters SMOG were said to bring good luck because they stood for Save Me, O God. Chike was also pretty good at football, and very soon his friends gave him a nickname too. They called him Chicks the Boy. Chike liked the name very much and wrote it on his new reader. It was from Samuel that Chike first heard how easy it was to cross the river Niger and come back again. I have done it many times on the ferry boat, Samuel told him. All you need is 6 pence to go over and 6 pence to return. Finish. But I have no 6 pence, said Chike. What? Said Samuel. A big boy like you has no 6 pence? Don't let people hear it. It's too shameful. Chike was really ashamed, and so he told a lie to cover his shame. He said, It's not that I don't have money. I have plenty, but my uncle keeps it for me. Then tell your uncle to give you 1 shilling out of it, said Samuel. What's the use of having money that you cannot spend? I shall ask him sometime, said Chike. But not yet. Time and tide wait for nobody, said Samuel in English. It was their teacher's favorite saying. And have you not heard, continued Samuel, that they are building a bridge across the river? They will finish it soon, and then there will be no more ferries. Chike had indeed heard of the bridge they were building. He was greatly troubled by what Samuel said. A few days later, Chike's friends were again talking about the river. They spoke about Asaba on the other side. Do you know, said Samuel to Chike, that as soon as you step out of the ferry in Asaba, you are in Midwestern Nigeria? Others agreed excitedly. They all had been to the Midwest. And do you know, said another boy whose name was Ezekiel, that once you're in Asaba, it is one way to Lagos? Yes, said Samuel, Lagos, second to London. I have not been to Lagos, but I know Asaba, which is poor man's Lagos. His companions laughed. Samuel sometimes talked like a grown man. This was one of the reasons why he was so popular with his companions. Chike's mind was far away in Midwestern Nigeria. He liked such flowing phrases. Midwestern Nigeria, a midsummer's night dream, the Isles of Man. Chapter 3. Chike on the banks of the river. Chike's uncle was a very strict man. He rarely spoke and never laughed except when he drank cold beer or palm wine with his neighbor, Mr. Mwaba, or with one of his other friends. He did not like to see Chike playing with other children. He called it a waste of time. In his opinion, children should spend their time reading and doing sums. His neighbor, Mr. Mwaba, agreed with him. His children played only when he was not around. Chike had a different opinion. According to his teacher, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Chike agreed completely with this saying. He wanted to tell his uncle about it, but he lacked the courage. One Saturday morning, Chike felt very brave. He stood behind his uncle and asked for a shilling. His uncle, who was shaving, turned around. He had a small mirror in his left hand and a razor in his right. His lower face was all covered with white soap suds. "What do you want a shilling for?" he asked. "I want to go on the ferry to Asaba before they build the bridge," replied Chike fearlessly. "Have you gone off your mind?" asked his uncle in great annoyance. "Run away from here before I count to 3. 1, 2. Chike fled from him. For the first time in many months, tears filled his eyes. "I will write a letter to my mother to send me the money," he said to himself. But then he remembered that his mother had warned him not to go near the river, so he became very sad. Later that day, his uncle told Mr. Mwaba about Chike's request. Mr. Mwaba put down his glass of palm wine and laughed. Then he said, "Asaba is too near. Why does he not want to go to Lagos?" Chike's uncle was not yet married. His servant Michael was a very big boy and he did all the difficult work in the house. He split firewood, went to the market, cooked, washed clothes, and ironed them. Chike washed the plates after meals and sometimes swept the rooms. They lived in 2 rooms. His uncle slept in one and kept all his boxes there. The soup pot and the other cooking vessels were hidden away under his huge iron bed. The other room had chairs, a round table in the center, framed photographs on the walls, a radio on the wooden pedestal in one of the 4 corners, a bookcase against the wall, and many other things. It was here that Michael and Chike slept. At night, they moved the round table aside and spread their mat on the floor. Chike did not like sleeping on the floor, and he longed for the bamboo bed in his mother's hut. There were other things he did not like. For example, there were bed bugs on their mat. Sometimes Michael sprinkled kerosene on the mat to kill them off. But after a few days, they were there again. Another thing Chike did not like was the large crowd of other tenants living in the same house. There were 10 rooms in the house and more than 50 men and women and children living in them. Many families lived in one room. Because there were so many strangers living together, they were always quarreling about firewood and about sweeping the yard and scrubbing the bathrooms and the latrines. There were only 2 latrines in the yard for 50 people. One was for adults and the other for children. Both were filthy, but the children's was worse. It swarmed with flies bigger than any Chike had ever seen in Umuahia. They revolted him. And so he learned that a big town was not always better than a village, but there were things he liked about Onitsha. Every Saturday, Michael went to the big market to buy provisions. Sometimes when he had many things to buy, he took Chike with him. Chike did not help in the buying, but in carrying some of the things home. He did not mind that at all. In fact, he liked it. While Michael bargained with the traders, Chike stood aside, watching the great river as it flowed peacefully down to the sea. He watched the fishermen in their canoes coming down the river or struggling up against it. Some of the canoes were houseboats. They had roofs of thatch over them. Chike was told that the fishermen lived for weeks or months in those boats. But what Chike liked most was to watch the big ferry boat. They looked enormous to him. He wondered what big ships would look like. His class teacher had told him that the big ships could only be seen in Lagos, Port Harcourt, or Burutu. But surely these ferry boats at Onitsha were big enough. What did anyone want bigger boats for? Even the canoes were big enough for some people to live in. The more Chike saw the river boats, the more he wanted to make the trip to Asaba. But where would he get money from? He did not know. Still he hoped. One day is one day, he said, meaning that one day he will make the journey, come what may. Chapter 4. Ezekiel the spoiled child. Chike was so anxious to find the money for his trip across the river that he very nearly went into bad ways. One of his friends called Ezekiel was a very bad boy. Like Chike, Ezekiel was his mother's only son. He had 4 sisters. Ezekiel's mother was a well-to-do trader who sold clothes in the Onitsha market and made much profit. But she was not a wise mother. She allowed Ezekiel to do whatever he liked, so he became a spoiled child. His mother had 3 servants who did all the housework. Sometimes Ezekiel's sisters were asked to wash plates or draw water from the public tap, but he never did any work. His mother said that housework was only for servants or for girls. So Ezekiel was developing into a lawless little imp. He would sneak quietly to the soup pot at night and search with his fingers for pieces of fish and meat. By morning, the soup was so sour, and Ezekiel's mother would punish the servants. One day, one of his sisters caught him red-handed. His hands were covered with egusi soup. But Ezekiel denied it all. His mother believed him. When Ezekiel grew bigger, he began to steal little sums of money from his mother. With this, he bought akara, mai, and granite at break. Sometimes, he was even able to buy whole packets of sweet biscuits or a tin of corned beef and a shilling loaf of bread. Needless to say, he was very popular at school. He was called Tough Boy, and his friends thought the world of him. Of course, they had no idea that he stole from his mother. Then one day, Ezekiel did something really awful. When he told his friends about it, they thought it was very clever until their headmaster told them how wrong it was. Ezekiel had somehow got hold of the names of 3 boys in England who wanted Nigerian pen friends. He wrote to them asking one to send him money, another to send him a camera, and a third to send him a pair of shoes. He drew a pattern of his right foot on a piece of paper and sent it along. He promised each of the boys a leopard skin in return. Of course, he had no intention of fulfilling the promise. For one thing, he had never seen a leopard skin in his life. After a month, he received a 10-shilling postal order from one of the boys. He showed it to his mother and she called him Clever Boy, which was one of the many fun names she had given him. Then she took him to the post office to cash the postal order. Ezekiel told his friends at school about his exploits, and they were all highly impressed. Tough boy was shouted on all ends. The same day, many other boys rushed off letters to England. Chike obtained 2 addresses, but could not write straight away because he had no money to buy postal stamps. He decided that as soon as he could find 6 pence, he would write to England and ask for 10 shillings or even £1. Then he would cross and recross the river as often as he liked. He thought how rich England must be when even a little boy could part with 10 shillings. He had seen the letter the boy wrote to Ezekiel. His name was John Smith, and he was age 12. Imagine that. Only 12, and yet he had 10 shillings to throw away. What did he want a leopard skin for? English people must be crazy, thought Chike. It was fortunate for Chike that he had no money to buy a postal stamp. If he had, he would have been in serious trouble along with Ezekiel and the others. One day at school, the headmaster called Ezekiel out and took him to his office. Later, he sent for 5 other boys. They were away for about an hour. Then the school bell rang and the classes stopped. The headmaster, stern and full of anger, spoke to the school. "I have just received a letter from the headmaster of a school in England," he said, and held up a blue letter for all to see. "The content of this letter has filled me with shame," he continued. "I did not know that among us here are thieves and robbers, wolves in sheep clothing. he spoke at length about Ezekiel's crime. Think of the bad name that you have given to this school, he said. Turning to Ezekiel and the 5 boys, they were all looking at the floor. Think of the bad name you have given to Nigeria, your motherland, he said, and the whole school sighed. Think how the school in England will always remember Nigeria as a country of liars and thieves because of these 6 scallywags here. Some of the pupils laughed because of the new word, scallywags. Yes, they were scallywags, said the headmaster. And they have spoiled your name in England. Some of you will go to study in England when you grow up. What do you think will happen to you there? I will tell you, as soon as you open your mouth and say you are from Nigeria, everybody will hold fast to his purse. Is that a good thing? The whole school shouted, No, sir. This is what these nincompoops here have done to you. There was more laughter at nincompoops, another strange word. Chike shivered. To think that if he had 6 pence, he would have stood there on the platform with the rest. He was sorry for Ezekiel and the others, but especially for his friend SMOG. The headmaster was still speaking. He said that Samuel's punishment would be the lightest and Ezekiel's the heaviest. Samuel had merely begged for a camera. He had not made a false promise to send a leopard skin in return. But the headmaster reminded the school that begging was a bad thing by itself. He said, a person who begged had no self-respect and had no shame and no dignity. He is an inferior person. In this school, we do not want to produce inferior people. Afterwards, Ezekiel was given 12 strokes of the cane and he cried. Samuel was given 6 strokes and the others 9 strokes each. Ezekiel's mother went to the headmaster's house that evening and rained abuses on him. From that day on, Ezekiel got new names at school. Some called him leopard skin, others called him scallywag or scallybeggar. Only his closest friends still called him tough boy. Chapter 5. Those who answered to Abraham. After the incident of the leopard skin, Chike lost all of his eagerness of crossing the Niger. He did not see how he could obtain 1 shilling without stealing or begging. His only hope now was that some kind benefactor might give him a present of 1 shilling without him begging for it. But where was he to find such a man, he wondered. Perhaps the best thing was for him to take his mind off the river Niger altogether. But it was not easy. On the last day of term, all the people were tidying up the school premises. The boys cut the grass in the playing field and the girls washed the classrooms. Chike's class was working near the mango tree with all the tempting ripe fruits, which they were forbidden to pick. They sang an old prisoner's work song and swung their blades to its beat. The last day of the term was always a happy, carefree day, but it was also a day of anxiety because the results of the term's examination would be announced. Of course, it was not a promotion examination. Still, an examination was an examination, and nobody liked to fail. Chike heard the headmaster shout, "Abraham!" and stood up to see what was happening. Some of the other boys also stood up. It was a trap. The headmaster picked out all those who had stood up and sent them to carry the missionaries' luggage to the village of Chike. "It is the price you have to pay for being over-curious," said the headmaster. And he told them the proverb about the over-curious monkey who got a bullet in the brain. Everyone laughed at the boys who had fallen into the headmaster's trap. Chike was 6 miles away by road. Somewhere on the road, there was a bridge across the river Kisa. So this bridge had been washed away by heavy rains. The missionaries' luggage was loaded into a lorry. The 7 boys who had been picked out were to travel in the lorry as far as the bridge. Then they would get down and carry the load across the stream and onto Okikpe, which was 2 miles from the river. The boys were scared, but the driver of the lorry told them that the river was shallow at this point. Still, they were afraid, especially Chike, who did not know how to swim. The lorry started, and Chike felt like a condemned prisoner. Some of the older boys frightened him more by telling stories of people who had been drowned while fording the river. There were stones on the riverbed, and if you missed your step once, you were finished, said Mark. Mark was a very big boy who was no good at his classwork. The other boys made fun of him and called him Papa. I know someone who went across it yesterday, and he said it was 5 feet deep, continued Mark. I shall refuse to go across, said Chike. Well, you can wait with your own share of the luggage until they rebuild the bridge, said Mark, who was enjoying himself enormously. Some of the bigger boys laughed. At last, they got to the river and the lorry stopped. Chike had taken a private decision to turn around if the water rose higher than his chest. After the luggage had been unloaded, Mark said that it should be divided into 7 equal loads. After all, we are all in the same class. We are all equals. But the driver of the lorry was very kind and gave only a small basket to Chike. Then each boy took off his clothes, wrapped them into a bundle, and carried them with the load on his head. Mark walked straight into the river and began to ford it. Some local people were coming over from the other side. A sudden feeling of defiance came upon Chike, and he followed Mark. Some of the bigger boys who had been laughing and boasting were now hanging back. The water rose to Chike's chest as at its deepest point, but he did not turn back. Once he stepped on a slippery stone and nearly fell, but he quickly regained his balance. The water, which had been growing deeper and deeper, was now becoming shallow again. Chike was pleased with himself. Soon he was on dry ground. He turned round proudly to see the others struggling through. The rest of the journey was uneventful, but the experience had been very important to Chike. It had given him a good deal of confidence in himself. He felt that any person who could ford a river deserves praise. There was one proverb which Chike's uncle was fond of saying: "It is bad that a man who had swum in the river Niger should be drowned in its small tributaries." It means that a man who had passed a big test should not fail a small one. Chike made a new proverb of his own. He said, "A man who can walk through the Nkisa with his bare feet should not be afraid to sail the Niger in a boat." Chapter 6. Brain Peel. Chike and the others got back to the school at about 6 in the evening. Of course, the school had long closed, so they went to the headmaster's house to hear their results. Chike and two other boys passed, but Mark and the others failed. As soon as he heard his results, Chike ran away as fast as he could for fear of being beaten by the disappointed and angry Mark. As soon as he had run away to safety, Chike slowed down to a walk. He remembered a poem their teacher had written. There was a dull boy in our class who swore at all costs I must pass. He read himself blind. He cluttered up his mind with pills and with buttons of class, and was bottom of class. Teacher wrote this little poem when 3 foolish pupils nearly died from swallowing brain pills. Some dishonest trader had told the 3 boys that pills would help them to remember what they read. So they bought the harmful drug from him and began to take them. But just before the examination, they were behaving like mad people and had been rushed to the hospital. They spent 5 days in the hospital and were then discharged. The doctors said they were very lucky. They might have damaged their brains permanently. As for the examination, the foolish boys had been so shaken that they failed hopelessly. Chike recalled all the wild rumors that spread through the school at the time. Before the boys were discharged from the hospital, it was rumored that the doctor had pronounced them permanently insane. Another rumor said that one of the boys had slapped the headmaster when he had gone to see them. The source of this last rumor was Ezekiel. Chike remembered how worn out the boys had looked the first day they returned to school. Everyone watched them closely for the least sign of unusual behavior. It was only after several days of watching that they were accepted as fully normal. By this time, the examinations were already over and the holidays were near. It must have been during the holidays that their teacher wrote the little poem, which he made public at the beginning of the next term. By then, several weeks had passed, and it was possible for everyone to laugh about the incident. Even the 3 unfortunate boys joined in. Chike was now approaching home. He had turned off the tarred road and was walking on the sandy footpath which formed a shortcut to number 15 Odu Street, where he lived. He found a hard, unripe orange by the wayside and began to kick it along the path. He imagined himself at center field in a big match. He would dribble past an imaginary opponent and shout, "Hey!" as spectators do when their favorite player outwits an opponent. Then he dribbled past 3 more and counted 1, 2, 3 before scoring an imaginary goal. "It's a goal!" he shouted and threw his arms in the air. Then he saw a shiny object which he kicked up with a lot of sand. He bent down and picked it up. For a brief moment, the world seemed to spin round him. He closed his eyes and then opened them again. Yes, it was there in his palm, a 6pence. He looked around to see if the owner of the money was coming behind him. There was no one. He looked ahead. No one was inside. He closed his hand on the coin and put his hand in his pocket. Then he walked boldly away. But soon he found himself running. I will stop at chapter 6 and we will continue from chapter 7 in our next session. Please join me, invite your friends and family and neighbors and tell them to join us at the fireside. Thank you.